So today I'm going to talk about how circuit courts are analyzing religious marks for genericness. And most recently, a circuit split was created for the trademark professionals in the room. You might be aware of how there are a million different ways to determine whether or not a mark is generic or not. And there really isn't a uniform way of determining this. I think that this paper provides a unique chance to look at a controlled environment for analyzing marks, or a subset of marks, that is religious marks, for genericness. And in my analysis, I simplified various factors that could potentially help courts use these factors for analysis and for marks in general, not just specific religious marks. So as I said, a circuit split was created recently, and the case that is central to my paper is Universal Church, which was a Second Circuit decision that came out late last year and was recently under review by the Supreme Court, but that was actually denied in around April. In this case, Universal Church was a Pentecostal church that owned the trademarks in Universal Church and the Universal Church. And these trademarks were canceled by the Second Circuit because they used a new generic test to analyze the marks. And we'll talk about the factors that they used, but these deviated from the analysis that other circuits are actually using to analyze religious marks specifically. This case is, and again, Universal Church and the Universal Church, the two marks in question, had reached incontestable status. This case in particular is important because, as we know, the Second Circuit is a very influential court when it comes to trademark law. This is the same court that gave us the spectrum of distinctiveness for Abercrombie. So again, Universal Church, the organization in this case, they actually owned a television arm which broadcasted a live television broadcast to over 800,000 people. So whether or not that television part of the company fell under the Universal brand, it's unclear, but if it did, then it does have repercussions for their consumer base and other religious marks, such as the following. Now, under the Second Circuit's analysis, these marks are potentially also at risk of cancellation. We look at the word Trinity, Christian, Catholic, God. If we analyze these in the same way that the Second Circuit analyzed them, these also could be at risk for cancellation if the Second Circuit's analysis doesn't go unchecked. So my goal of the paper is to resolve the circuit split. And what I do is I propose a uniform analysis for analyzing religious marks for genericness. And the reason for doing this is really to prevent the inconsistent results that we've all seen in trademark law. Just to give you an example for religious marks specifically, I'll just ask the audience what your thoughts are on where New Thought Church, where does that fall on the spectrum of distinctiveness in your view? New Thought Church. Suggestive?
Suggestive.
Okay. This was actually considered generic. What about Christian Science Church? Suggestive again. That was considered generic. Okay, what about Church of the Creator? That was considered descriptive. Okay, and then lastly, Assembly of God. That was actually descriptive. But as you can see, it's just completely arbitrary. There's no rhyme or reason. And I feel like this isn't just for religious marks. In my analysis of just reviewing generic tests across the board, it gets even more arbitrary and ambiguous the way that courts are looking at these various factors of how to decide when a mark is generic. So So what we're going to do today, again, I'm just going to go over my outline. I'm going to summarize the main points, and then talk about some of the major questions that I have encountered in writing my paper. Okay, I thought it was one of those motion sensor things.
No.
Okay.
The other room, I can turn up just this bank, which let that be more visible. But this is taking it all, and you're using actual notes. She was using the computer, so I'm going to leave you alone.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. Okay. So in part one, talk about the law. I specifically mention what I find very interesting is in 1989 there was a trademark revision to the Trademark Act, and what happened was that prior to this there was no even reference to the word generic in the Lanham Act. And so how they define generic terms is they call them common descriptive terms. And only until after 1989 did they start calling generic terms generic name. So, as you might realize, there's a lot of semantic confusion, especially when even most recently in 2015, the Federal Circuit refers to the pre-1989 statutory language of common descriptive term to define a generic mark. And so this makes us question, okay, well, are we talking about descriptiveness when we look at generic marks, or do we not? And so there is, in the body of case law, there are all of these different uses of statutory language depending on whether it's pre or post the 1989 amendment. I also look at specifically the generic test, which is set out in section 1604(3) of the Lanham Act, which is found here. And this specifically states that the primary significance of the registered mark to the relevant public rather than purchaser motivation shall be the test for determining whether the registered mark has become the generic name of goods and services. So this is considered the generic test in the Lanham Act. Okay, to me, this doesn't make a lot of sense. What does primary significance of a mark mean? Who is the relevant public? Depending on how you define these terms, the results are completely different for the trademark analysis. And so, you know, in reading this, it doesn't really provide a lot of clarity. So what I did is I looked at other parts of the Lanham Act to see if there are other tests that were provided that could give a little bit more explanation as in terms of what Congress actually intended. And so in the section related to dilution, there is a test for famous marks. And in this test, Congress, the statutory language specifically states that the audience making a decision on whether a mark is famous is specifically the general consuming public of the United States. Okay, that's much more specific than relevant public. Okay, general consuming public of the United States versus relevant public. So again, you know, reading this together with the generic test provided in 1604(3), I think provides at least a bit of comparison as to what Congress's intent really meant. I haven't really made what Congress meant. I think they're washing their hands. Okay, so what's that? Oh, well, I will talk over it if you're just not this time.
We've got the idea that you think that the statute needs a little cleansing itself.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm glad that came
That was a
through.
good object lesson, but yes, effective.
Okay. I'm sure, yeah, exactly. So again, bottom line, this definition is very unclear and it's led to a lot of inconsistent results. So in part two, I talk about the circuit split. What I do is I choose the Second Circuit's analysis and the Seventh Circuit's because I think these are the most dichotomous views. And we'll talk about those factors a little bit later. I also bring in the Sixth Circuit's analysis as well as the Eighth Circuit's just to provide a bit of variation so that the readers can really understand how bad the problem is. And what I think is interesting is that in the petition that was before the Supreme Court, the petitioners actually grouped together the Sixth, Seventh, and Eighth Circuit's way of analyzing generic marks on one side of the fence, and on the other side of the fence was the Second Circuit. But in my analysis, I think that this is very hard to do because each circuit's test is completely different. So I'm not even sure if it was really the best way to frame the discussion before the Supreme Court. Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. Okay, so the Second Circuit versus the Seventh Circuit is what I chose for the split, and then brought in the Sixth Circuit and the Eighth Circuit just to show the variation. Okay, so in analyzing the circuit split, I looked at several key factors. I look at how each court defines generic, how they define the relevant public, the types of evidence that courts use in their analysis, and also how the courts weight that evidence. And then I also talk about the anti-deception rule, which was articulated by the Supreme Court, in that we should look at trademarks as a whole instead of dissecting them in piecemeal fashion and then analyzing the separate parts of that trademark. So, for example, instead of looking at universal church, someone who violated the anti-deception rule would look at universal only rather than universal church. And I'm not actually going to talk about the point I made about the public domain in this session, but I'm happy to talk about it afterwards with anyone who's interested. Okay, so this chart simplifies my analysis, and what I've done is I've created, each row is one of the factors that I've looked at and distinguished between what the Second Circuit says and what the Seventh Circuit says. The first row talks about how the courts define generic. The second row is how the courts define relevant public. Third is how the courts, what kind of evidence they use. And then the fourth is whether or not they follow the anti-deception rule or not. And again, I'm not going to talk on the public domain at this point. So as you can see in red, these are the points of contention that I found. The Second Circuit views the relevant public as the relevant purchasing public, and also not the population at large. So they're not looking at the broad term of the entire universe of the public in general in the United States. By contrast, the Seventh Circuit actually does talk about the contemporary public as being the relevant public. So they're talking about everybody in the United States, which is an incredibly broad standard. In terms of what kind of evidence is used, the Second Circuit focuses on expert testimony and also dictionary definitions. And the dictionary definition, I think, is interesting because the Second Circuit actually looked at the Oxford English Dictionary and chose a definition that wasn't the very first one. It was like, I don't know, probably fourth on the list. And even lower than that if you take into the sub-definitions on that list of definitions for the trademark universal. And so the definition that they used, the Second Circuit used to hinge, to make their decision to cancel the marks, was that the definition was based on sources from the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. And they're trying to equate these definitions as meaning that this is what the definition is in contemporary use, what someone would think in today's society as the meaning of the word. So the Second Circuit, by contrast, said that no historical definitions are allowed. So it's a complete 180. And in terms of the anti-deception rule, the Second Circuit also violated that. As I said earlier, they looked at universal on its own rather than looking at the term universal church as a phrase. And in the Seventh Circuit's case, they did uphold the anti-deception rule. So the trademark in question at that point was Church of the Creator. So instead of looking at church and creator separately, they looked at the entire phrase, Church of the Creator. Again, this is a simplification of what the Sixth Circuit said versus the Eighth Circuit in terms of their the way that they analyze religious marks for genericness. Again, the part in red is where these circuits differ. The first row in red states how they define generic. The Sixth Circuit defines it as whether the public perceives the term primarily as designation of the article. By contrast, the Eighth Circuit faithfully applies the language of the Lanham Act, and in fact, they're the only circuit court to do so. When it comes to defining the relevant public, the Sixth Circuit talks about the general public. They talk about popular perception. And this is more along the lines of the Seventh Circuit's opinion of defining the relevant public. The Eighth Circuit, by contrast, is much more narrow. They talk about consumers specifically, and they even narrow it further than that, and they're saying those consumers can't be persons in the trade. So very specific. In terms of the types of evidence that the courts use in determining genericness, the Sixth Circuit looks at a whole slew of evidence ranging from expert and lay testimony, dictionary definitions, they even threw in a Wikipedia entry. The funny thing is that the court analyzed all of that evidence, but then they just decided, nope, sorry, that's not enough. It still is not determinative of whether the mark is generic or not. But one thing that the Sixth Circuit did do, which I think is interesting, is that they did give credence to the fact that the mark under question had incontestable status. And so under the Lanham Act, it does state that if a mark has reached incontestable status, that there's a presumption that the mark is non-generic. And the Sixth Circuit is the only one to give credence to the statutory language. And by contrast, the other circuits don't even mention it. And I think the Seventh Circuit even said, it doesn't matter. We're not going to take it into consideration. And by contrast, the Eighth Circuit looks at evidence such as advertisements and affidavits from church leaders. So again, I think the point here for the evidence is that there's no real way of determining what evidence we should be looking at, how much weight should be given to certain categories of evidence, and how that should be determined. So part 3 is where I resolve the circuit split. And what I do is present a uniform method of analysis for analyzing these marks. And the reason for doing so is, again, to prevent forum shopping, to make sure that there isn't confusion amongst the consumer base or against the public, to protect goodwill and the reputation of the trademark holders, and again, to prevent these inconsistent results. So the uniform analysis that I present is based on 3 different factors. The first one is standardizing the interpretation of the relevant public. Second, making sure that courts use a consistent way of applying evidence. And then third, using a taxonomy of well-established religious hierarchy. So this is actually from, and I can go into more detail of this in a second, but similar to the spectrum of distinctiveness, I think using this continuum to categorize religious marks would be helpful in creating uniformity. So to go in further detail, by standardizing the interpretation of relevant public, what I have presented is really try to figure out, the plain language meaning of relevant. Obviously, if the statutory language, if Congress intended for the relevant public to be the general public, they wouldn't have used the word relevant. I think it implies a more narrow interpretation. I also think, relevant should be, and again, using the plain language of the word relevant, it should be, who is interested in the mark? Who shares a connection with it? Who's interested? And so I think it should be the population of people who share a connection with the mark. So this kind of cuts out the outliers and the extremes. It's not necessarily the general public as a whole of the entire United States, and it's not specifically religious adherents like Adventist Christians. It also gives courts room for interpretation and how they define who the relevant public is. So the second factor, I talk about consistent application of evidence, and some of the rules that I think would be important for courts to follow would be to apply the anti-dissection rule in all instances, including dictionary definitions. Incontestable status should be given weight and should be followed according to the language of the Lanham Act. Judicial opinions of public opinion should be admitted. In at least 2 out of the 4 cases, I found that judges were freely offering their opinions on what public opinion is and taking it as a matter of law. And so I think that would lead to a slippery slope, and it is an abuse of discretion. I think it should be based on well-constructed surveys of who the relevant public is. So in part 4, in third part of the 3-factor analysis, I talked about, I briefly mentioned earlier, about this taxonomy, this hierarchical structure. So the Second Circuit has created a really useful hierarchy of defining religious marks, and they've grouped it according to religion, group, and denomination. So by illustration, for example, the religion would be Christianity. Group would be Orthodox, Protestant, Catholic, and then denomination would be Methodist, Baptist, Society of Friends, Russian Orthodox. These are some examples. So if we can consistently apply our analysis along this continuum, I think it would make the categorization of religious marks a little bit more uniform. So in part 4, I talk about why the Supreme Court really should have reviewed the case. They should have provided a little bit more clarity for the generic test, and I thought that this was a good vehicle for them to do so, given that the Second Circuit and the Seventh Circuit opinions were so different, or their analysis is so different. I briefly touch on First Amendment considerations, and then also talk about how the Second Circuit's decision will impact not only religious organizations, but media companies who are under the umbrella of religious organizations, and how their marks could potentially be canceled. Yeah.
In the context of the First Amendment, did you notice, I think you mentioned in your paper that obviously the First Amendment requires neutrality toward religion. Was there any hints or any suggestion that maybe the Second Circuit or the other courts kind of went past that, maybe had some animosity or?
That's a really good question. I was looking for that, and I was very sensitive to that as I was reading these. I didn't sense anything. I wanted to in a way because it could have made an easier point for me, but I really think that they, I'm not sure exactly why they chose to use the standards that they do, especially with the historical use of the definitions. I thought it was reaching when, I think it's pretty well understood that when you look at a definition for marks generic, you just use usually the first one on the list. You don't really kind of pick one that proves your point.
Right.
So I didn't see any animosity, but only time will tell. But it's a good question. Also, one of the reasons I said that the Supreme Court didn't review it is so the Second Circuit opinion was a summary order and it doesn't have precedential effect, and so I am wondering if that was one of the reasons why they chose not to review it. So that was another point that I made. Okay, so again, in summary, the main points in my paper were just to show that there should be a uniform generic test for religious marks, and quite frankly for all marks in general, because I think it is it's a minefield in terms of analysis. I'm sure all of you are fully aware of that. I also think that there should be a uniform definition of relevant public, and there should be consistent ways to choose and weight evidence. I think the court should adhere to the anti-dissection rule and apply this continuum of this religious hierarchical structure. And so some of the questions that came up when I was writing this and doing my research was that I first got on a tangent, which I am probably going to take out, of the fact that a mark is generic ab initio versus whether it has become generic. If you were looking at the specific language of section 1604.3, if we can go back, this test only applies to marks which have become generic, So I got on a tangent thinking that, okay, well maybe there is a chance where a mark could actually be registered in the first instance, even though it is generic. And I know that's, against widely held understanding of trademark law, but I have found certain provisions in the Lanham Act which could potentially suggest that it is possible. I also thought about bringing in other generic tests, but I think I'm going to leave it as is. Because I think for ways to analyze it is enough, but the Federal Circuit has an interesting way to, define it, and so does the, and so does the Ninth Circuit. So I don't know what y'all's opinions are on that. I think for just a short paper, it's better to just be concise and not have too many different types of tests out there. I also was trying to figure out how to find what the congressional intent of relevant public is. I haven't really been able to get much detail on that. If y'all have any advice on, how to find that, I know that in Hein Online you can look at the congressional records and the discussions. But I really haven't found anything that's specific to relevant public.
You got a window blocking the screen text there.
Oh yeah, thanks.
That's it, you got it. Read it again.
Okay. And then again, I was just wondering what y'all's thoughts were as to why there are so many interpretations of how to determine whether a mark is generic, and then also, should there be more room for interpretation in the definitions that I've listed, or should we create uniformity? So, any comments